This is Mother's Day today, and normally in our church we would have a way to honor all of you moms publicly. Unfortunately, we're going to have to settle for each one of you who is a mom. Hopefully there's folks in your life that are able to call you, talk to you, let you know how much they appreciate you. But moms, just from me to all of you, we certainly think the world of you. We know that God has blessed all of us with a mom. We know that there's no substitute for a mother's love, and so we honor you today. Unfortunately, we can't do it publicly, but we honor you through this video, and collectively, I know we all feel that way for you. If you haven't had an opportunity to watch the video that was posted first on Facebook by me earlier this week, as well as then we put it up on the YouTube video, our YouTube channel, please watch that. It has to do with our plans for reopening moving forward. Essentially, we plan to continue what we've been doing via the internet and offering the same sorts of things that we've been offering for the next 5 weeks. June 14th is the first Sunday at this point that we tentatively plan to have our first in-person service again. And again, I'll give more explanation in that video. So if you haven't had a chance to watch that, go ahead and look that up and watch that if you would. Well, as it is Mother's Day this morning, I'm shifting gears away from our series that we've been in, and I'm going to look this morning at a passage to address motherhood in general. You know, if you were asked the question, who would you list as a great woman of faith in our day and age? I mean, if Jesus were here today and you would envision, who might he reference or point to as examples of somebody or women who are great women of faith, who do you think they might be? Maybe you think of your own mom. Maybe you grew up with a Christian mom and she led an exemplary example. Certainly she wouldn't have been perfect, but she led a good example of what it is to be a godly woman of faith. Or maybe a grandmother or an aunt. Maybe it's some woman in the church that you were a part of who just served faithfully in some role or another for decades and just led an exemplary example. You know, imagine a woman in your life, maybe someone in your extended family or in your community, or somebody that is not even a believer. And maybe they've got some well-known aspects to their lifestyle that do not line up with what we think of as a good, strong Christian. And imagine Jesus being present and you seeing him in an interaction with that woman and him commending her as a woman of faith. You know, I thought about coming up with some people in our culture and listing them as an example, but I don't want to insult anyone, even people that, you know, we know are not professing believers or living in that way. But you all know people like that. You all know people who maybe live on the fringe of society or who are just a very worldly minded type person, that they don't embrace Christian values. And you can picture someone like that. You know, why would Jesus ever speak about someone like that and commend them for their great faith? Well, this morning I want us to consider a story in the Bible where that very thing happens, where a woman just like what I just described is commended by Jesus of being a woman of faith. And specifically in the story, it revolves around a mother. And so I've entitled this message, A Surprising Mother of Faith. This story is found in Matthew chapter 15. If you have your Bibles, encourage you to look there with me. Matthew 15, verses 21 through 28. And I'm going to read. It says this: And Jesus went away from there, and he withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and was crying, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon." But he did not answer her a word. And his disciples came and begged him, saying, "Send her away, for she's crying out after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and she knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." And he answered, It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "O woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire." And her daughter was healed instantly. Several things I just want us to consider about this woman here in this story. And the first thing is this: she was a pagan. She was a pagan. We're told here that she comes from the land of Tyre and Sidon. Now, these were the two major cities in the area of Phoenicia. And what scholars tell us about this area, and that it was Gentile for sure, but that they were idolatrous like many of the Gentile cultures around Israel. They worshipped a host of false gods. Some of the more prominent ones were Baal, Astarte, Melkart, and some various other local deities that they were known for worshiping. In some instances, in fact, people from this region, some of the women were known collectively to practice forms of prostitution in honor of the goddess Astarte. We also are told that there were practices of human sacrifice amongst them, particularly children sacrifices in times of great danger, like times of war, where they needed help and they were desperate. They would even resort to offering one of their children in a human sacrifice to their god. Typically, what we can tell is that they would kill that child with a fire and offer it on an altar to their god. So this was a pretty wicked culture. They had certainly some very wicked elements built into their culture. Matthew uses the term Canaanite in his gospel to refer to this woman. He describes her here in verse 22 as a Canaanite woman. Now, Mark's gospel also tells this story, and he doesn't use the term Canaanite. He uses the term Syrophoenician, or a woman from Phoenicia, a Gentile, I believe is what he says. And in fact, interestingly, this is the only place in all of the New Testament where the word Canaanite is used at all. Canaanite was really an Old Testament word, and it conjures up the images of the people in what would become the promised land as Israelites would go in, and they were told to push all of these people out of the land. Because of their wickedness, because of their idol worship, including the human sacrifices that they practice. And so Matthew seems to be taking this Old Testament word, which had strong derogatory connotations for Jews, and he describes this woman not as a Gentile or as a Phoenician, but as a Canaanite. To describe essentially that this was a woman who would have been viewed in the same way that the ones that God's judgment, his harsh and severe judgment, came down upon in the Old Testament. We see further that this woman's daughter is demon-possessed. Now, we've been talking in our own series about the enemy that we face in Satan, and we've talked a bit about demon possession or demonization of people. And one of the things that I've mentioned in the past is that, from what we can tell, demons don't have the liberty to just come into people or possess people or sort of take over elements of their life. Essentially, what we can tell is that people have to sort of open the door for that to happen. They have to invite Satan and his influence and his presence into their life, either overtly or sometimes inadvertently through certain practices. Or it seems that parents can make decisions on behalf of their children that invite those demonic presences into the life of their child. Interestingly, Mark uses a term in his gospel for this girl that describes her specifically as a young girl. It's in Greek, it's called the diminutive form of a word, which means a small or a young version of the thing that's being described. And so here, this seems like this is a very young girl. This is not an older teenager, someone who's of age to be married. Probably not even, 9, 10, or 11-year-old. This is probably a very young girl who has been possessed or significantly demonized, according to how it's described. And so that would seem to hint that probably this girl's upbringing resulted in some way in the invitation of demonic presences, probably through some sort of false worship, maybe even directly worship in some sort of a way of the spirit realm by this Canaanite woman. And so what we can say from the outset is that this was not an ideal woman in the sense of religiously speaking. This is not a God-fearing woman. This was not a woman who kind of led a life and had a heritage of serving God. More than likely, this was a very worldly, pagan woman who comes to Jesus. And so we see that she was a pagan, but then secondly, the story reveals that she is powerless. She comes to him in verse 22 and she says, "My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon." Now, that phrase, severely oppressed, it's two words in the Greek, and it literally would be translated badly demonized. And so different translations will translate it differently, but all of them sort of make the same point, that this was a severe case of demonization. This was a severe case of demon activity in this young girl's life. She was likely out of control of her body. I mean, we see other stories in the New Testament of people that when they were being controlled by a demon, they would writhe, they would be out of control of their own body. In one other story, a man's son was being thrown into water or into a fire against his will. And so this seems like whatever was going on, it was something severe. It wasn't minor. And, what's a person to do in that situation? Here's this mom faced with a situation where some spirit presence is dominating the life of her young child. And what's she to do? Where does she turn? Can she give the daughter medicine? Well, no, medicine doesn't work against demonic oppression. Maybe she just disciplines the daughter a little bit and teach the daughter not to act that way. Again, that'd be foolish. And you can't lecture her, you can't bribe her. In essence, the mom's in a situation where her daughter needs help, and there's nothing she can do. I wonder, moms, as you consider your own time with your kids, how often you've been at a point like that, where you see a need that your child has, and your motherly instinct is to meet that need, to nurture, to help, to provide care, and it's just totally out of your control. There's nothing you can do. Maybe it's something physical. Maybe they've got some physical ailment, some physical problem, some diagnosis. And you realize that it's not a matter of just finding a different doctor or coming up with the money rather to buy the medication or to have the procedure done. There's just nothing medically you can do to provide help for your child. Maybe it's an issue at school. Maybe it's not physical. Maybe it's, your child's getting bullied by some other kids and they come home in tears, or they come home and they're beginning to withdraw socially, and you're concerned for them and you wish you could be there and do something, but there's not really anything that you can do to stop the other kids from being cruel to your child. Maybe there's some disappointment that your son or daughter is facing. Maybe they didn't make the team. Maybe, they tried out and they didn't make it. Maybe there's a person that they had feelings for and they got rejected. And they go into a state of just despondent and depressed and sad. And you've tried to cheer them up and you've tried to encourage them. And, you try to convince your daughter that she is beautiful, even though the boy that she liked rejected her. You try to convince your son that he has other things of value, even though he hasn't been able to make the team. And it just doesn't work. And you don't know what to do. Maybe it's a spiritual issue. Maybe your son or daughter is old enough to recognize what they need when it comes to their spiritual walk, and they've rejected it. And they've sort of turned their back on Jesus, and you've tried to raise them to love God and to respect His Word, and it's just not for them. And there's rebellion going on, and they've rejected it, and you don't know what else to do. You've tried disciplining them, you've tried some sort of therapy or counseling, you've tried whatever you know to do, and nothing works. and you're desperate. You're powerless. What do you do? This is sort of where this woman is at in the story. She's got a situation with her daughter, and it's unlike any situation she's faced before. I'm sure whatever she tried, if she went to the religious priests or leaders in her town and tried to get them to help ward off these evil spirits, tried to figure out what does she need to do to get rid of these spirits. She's probably tried to tell the spirits to leave, and nothing has worked. And so what does she do? Well, we see thirdly here that she does a very prudent thing. She's prudent in that she recognizes Jesus is the one that my daughter needs. He is the only one that can bring the sort of healing that she's desperate for. And so she wisely comes and seeks out Jesus to come and get help for her daughter. Verse 22 here in Matthew 15 specifically says she comes to Jesus and she calls him Lord and Son of David. This term Lord is a word that recognizes his authority. It's a term of respect, recognizes his position over her. And so it's a word that implies submission to him on her part. And then Son of David is probably the most interesting and significant because this was a very Jewish term. I mean, Son of David. This coming from a Gentile woman. She didn't grow up with the Old Testament. I mean, did she even know who David was? Did she understand the significance of son or descendant of David? And here she is referring to Jesus as essentially, you are the long-awaited Messiah, the one who is going to be a descendant of David in the Old Testament scriptures. You're the one the Jews have been waiting for. I believe you are the Messiah. That's essentially what she is saying when she refers to him as her Lord and as the Son of David. I heard at least one scholar suggest that probably she was using a term that she had heard others use about Jesus, and she probably didn't even know what it meant. You know, that other Jews who clamored about Jesus and praised him, that they would refer to him as the Son of David, and she sort of takes this religious term and uses it, probably not even understanding what it meant. I'm not sure that that's the case or not. That's certainly speculation. But either way, again, what a surprising declaration from a woman from her background. How did she even know who Jesus was? Where did she hear about him? Where did she begin to have faith that he was the answer to her daughter's problems? I think the likely answer to that question is she must have heard about him from the crowds, from the people who had seen it. In fact, maybe even she herself had witnessed some of his miracles and some of the things that he became immensely famous for, the many healings and the casting out of demons that he had already done. In fact, in Mark's gospel, Mark chapter 7 is where we find this story. But prior to that, in Mark chapter 3, we have another account where it says Jesus withdrew. This is verse 7, Mark 3:7. Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea, and a great crowd followed from Galilee and Judea and Jerusalem and Idumea, and from beyond the Jordan and from around Tyre and Sidon. When the great crowd heard all that he was doing, they came to him. And so notice, way back in chapter 3 of Mark's gospel account, people from all over, including from the regions of Tyre and Sidon, were coming to see and hear and experience Jesus. Gentiles were enamored with him just like the Jews were. His acts of healing and these amazing miracles he was performing, a word had spread. And so whether this woman had seen it firsthand herself or whether she had heard about him from others who had gone from in her area, word had clearly spread to the towns where she comes from. And so she knows, man, this isn't normal. Nobody else can do these sorts of things. What possesses a person to enable them to do this? Well, are they possessed by a demonic force? And I think the obvious answer is, he's a good man. He does good things. He's in control of his body. And so, no, this isn't the same as what the demons and the evil spirits do. This is a good man. Whatever he does it from God, from a good and caring and loving perspective. And so my guess is, and probably it was this crisis with her own daughter that kind of brought her to a decision point. What am I going to do? Am I going to continue to worship the gods that can't help me? The gods that give me no answers? The gods that are no solution whatsoever to the situation my daughter's in? In fact, whether she recognized it or not, the worship of those gods was very likely what opened the door for her daughter to be possessed with these demons in the first place. Again, we've looked elsewhere in the series that we've been in on Satan and demons and such, that the worship of false gods is referred to as the worship of demons throughout both the Old and the New Testament. We see the examples of that. And so at some point she seems to have come to the conclusion this Jesus and whatever he is teaching about God is distinct from all of the religious things that I've been taught growing up. He's got answers and solutions that no other religious entity or deity has ever been able to provide. And maybe she even explored somehow those Old Testament prophecies. Maybe she talked to some people who knew. Maybe she went and investigated from people in Jerusalem and discovered what Son of David was all about. Who is this man? In her research to figure out how to get help for her daughter. Either way, she seems to have come to the conclusion, I've got nowhere else to turn but to this Jesus. And she turns to him out of an act of wisdom. You know, there is a story, or an article rather, that is written by a man by the name of Darren Carlson, entitled Minor Prophets in My Home. And he goes on to talk about how our children serve as minor prophets to us. In other words, young prophets. They kind of reveal things to us. God uses our children to teach us lessons about him, is essentially the point of the article. And he lists various ways that our children tend to reveal the idols of our own heart in our own lives. And one of those ways, he says, you know, when our children fail at the things that we succeeded in as kids, and we find ourselves growing frustrated over that. You know, dads were great at sports, and they love sports, and they want their son to love sports and to be good at it, and he's just not as coordinated. He's just not as passionate about it. He's not as good at it. Or mom loved music or the arts, and she tries to teach her own daughter, and in her mind she envisions, my daughter's going to be better than I was because I'm going to be their teacher, and I'm going to help them even earlier than I was taught. But they just don't pick it up. And that frustration is felt. It kind of reveals to us an element of an idol. For us could be that, maybe we're more interested in making our kids like us than we are making them like Jesus. Are we more driven to see our loves, our values, our passions carried on by our kids, or do what we really want is for them to latch on to Jesus? Which is really what our goal as parents should be. Another example he uses in that article, he talks about when we tend to see our own sinful tendencies being displayed in our children. When we see our angry temper being demonstrated by our kids, and they tend to respond with a temper the same way we do. When we hear them gossip and talk flippantly about other people in their life, and we think, well, that was kind of rude. And we realize, ooh, I talk about other people that way. When our son struggles with lust and lustful looks and lustful thoughts, and we realize as men, well, boy, I've kind of led by example in the things that I've allowed us to watch on the television or whatever. When we have those kinds of epiphanies, we're reminded that we, as parents, still have a long way to go. And once again, we realize that if our goal is to point our kids to us, if our goal is to make our kids like us, we're going to create some things in our kids that we don't like. Again, our goal should always be to point our kids to Jesus, to realize that he is the one that they need to be pursuing, that he's the one that has the answers for their life. Another example of one that he didn't mention in his article, but what happens when we have a child, or oftentimes maybe a teenager, who begins to rebel? I think early on as parents, we kind of live under this illusion that we are able to control our kids' behavior. Particularly if you're sort of a disciplinarian by nature and maybe you grew up with somewhat strict parents and they kept you in line by having rules and discipline and they followed through. Again, all those things are good, but when our kids are younger, I think we're able to maintain this sense that I can control my kids' behavior as long as I consistently discipline, as long as I set up the right rules, as long as I keep them from certain exposure to certain people or certain things in their life. And we kind of have this illusion of control. But as they get older and older, suddenly some of the things we used to do that would kind of keep them in line just doesn't work anymore. I can remember the last time my dad gave my brother and me a spanking. I think I was 13 at the time, and I hadn't gotten a spanking in years. And I don't know if it was out of habit or just sort of impulsively, but I don't remember, my brother and I were doing something, and my dad was correcting us, and he threatened us with a spanking. He's like, hey, if you guys don't knock it off, I'm going to give you a spanking. And I remember it struck both my brother and me as somewhat humorous because, well, we kind of felt like that was a thing of the past. We hadn't gotten a spanking in a long time, and so we both kind of laughed. We might have even said something like, yeah, sure. I mean, I really don't remember. But I remember my dad was like, you think I'm kidding? We will. And so I think my brother or I said something like, okay. And so he marched us up to the bedroom, and he got the paddle out, and he spanked us each, and neither of us, it didn't flinch. We didn't act like it hurt. And my dad, I don't remember if he said it then or if he said it later. He said, well, he realized, I guess that's the last time I'm going to use that. Because he told us later that, he knew we were a little older, and he said he swung as hard as he could to make a point, and we didn't budge. And so, again, maybe you've had those experiences where things that worked in the past when your kids were younger and you were able to bring about the results that you wanted, suddenly they don't work anymore. Your son or daughter's doing their own thing. You've tried reasoning with them. You've tried disciplining them. You've tried ramping up the discipline. You've tried bribing them, and nothing works. And you begin to realize, you know what? My son or daughter is a free individual. They have to make certain decisions. I can't make them make the decisions I'd like. I can't manipulate them or lead them to make what I think are the best decisions for their life. And you begin to feel helpless or powerless. I really believe at some level this is part of God's plan in parenting. I think at some level one of the reasons why God allows parents to interact with the difficulty of parenting is because it kind of both and. It reminds us how much our kids need Jesus, and it also reinforces and reminds us how much we still need Jesus. As much as we would like to think that we've got the answers, that we're wise enough, that we're intuitive enough to understand what's going on and what to do, there's a sense in which children and teenagers, more than anything else, I think drives us to our knees in humility and says, God, have mercy on me as a parent. I need help. I don't have the answers. I can't make my son or daughter do what I know they need to do, what I believe they need to do. God, I need help. That's where this woman's at. She's been driven to this place of desperation, and her desperation has driven her in a good place. It's driven her to seek out Jesus. And not only is she prudent in her decision to pursue Jesus, but what we see in this story, fourthly, is that she's persistent. She's persistent because when she comes to Jesus, she encounters some obstacles in her interaction with him. First off, we see she comes to Jesus. She lays her heart out. Have mercy on me, on my child. They're possessed severely with this demon. Please help. And what does Jesus do in verse 23? He ignores her. He ignores her. I mean, that's rude, isn't it? Doesn't it seem kind of rude? Verse 23, it says, but he did not answer her a word. He ignores her. And evidently she's going on and just refuses to stop asking, even though he's ignoring her. She refuses to take a hint. She refuses to just walk away and give up and say, well, okay, tried that. I guess that's another dead end. She is so convinced that Jesus is the answer that she's not going to leave. I mean, even the disciples seem to get what she doesn't get. The disciples say to Jesus, why don't you just tell this woman to leave? Like, she's not getting it. She doesn't seem to understand that she's not wanted here. She doesn't seem to understand how to take no for an answer. You know, obviously, Jesus, you've tried to politely let her down, not drawing too much attention. You've ignored her, and she doesn't get it. Why don't we just put it out there? Tell her, hey, get lost. You're a Gentile anyways. You don't belong here. Maybe you felt like that. Maybe not quite the same way, but you've come to this point at the end of yourself. You've cried out to Jesus on behalf of one of your sons or daughters, and you've begged for his intervention. You've begged for his help, and it feels like he ignores you. It feels like all you hear are the sound of crickets. And you've come again and again, and nothing. This woman's experience, that's what she was going through. But for her, it actually gets worse, because not only does Jesus ignore her, but what we see here is that he goes on then to insult her. In verse 26, he finally answers her, but when he does, he tells her, he says, look, woman, it isn't right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. He clearly implies that she's among the dogs, not among the children. She's a dog in his view. She's not one of the children. This term dog was a common insult. Really, I think we could fairly say it was a racial slur. It was anyone who wasn't a Jew was looked down on by the Jews, and they referred to them as dogs. It was sort of a synonym, or you could say a euphemism, for an unbeliever, for a pagan, for someone who was on the outside. Earlier, in fact, Jesus in his own teaching earlier in the Gospel of Matthew, he warns, do not give the dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before swine. And so he's referring there to dogs and taking that which is holy and giving it to those who are not going to appreciate it, those who are just going to trample on it and ignore it. In Philippians, Paul says in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 2, he says, look out for the dogs, look out for the evildoers, look out for those who mutilate the flesh. Here, Paul is taking the term dogs and he's reversing it and throwing it back on the Jews who are unbelievers, those who have rejected Jesus. And he refers to them in an insulting way as dogs. They're the equivalent of the evildoers. In fact, even in Revelation chapter 22, looking at those who are going to be on the outside in eternity looking in, he says, outside are the dogs and sorcerers and the sexually immoral and murderers and idolaters and everyone who loves and practices falsehood. So dogs was not a kind word. It was an insult in that culture to those who are the equivalent of unbelievers or evildoers. Now, historically, Christian commentators have looked for ways to soften what Jesus says to this woman, to kind of take the edge off, to the whole idea of Jesus insulting a woman in need just doesn't feel right. It's not the Jesus we think of. It just feels like, well, how could you do that? That's just not nice. And Jesus was nice. That's kind of the thinking. And so, one approach that's quite popular actually amongst what I would maybe refer to as more liberal commentators, those who don't accept the full truthfulness and the accuracy of what Scripture says, is they suggest that Jesus probably didn't really say this, that this was sort of a later addition by Jews as they retold this tradition or this story. And so the accounts of this encounter include some additional comments that Jesus didn't actually say. Mark, using those traditional accounts, included it in his story, and then Matthew copied from Mark, included it in his. And so they basically say Jesus didn't actually say this. Others who are more conservative, who accept the truthfulness of Scripture, they take it at face value, they've tried to soften it by pointing out, again here, that, well, the Greek word used for dog is likewise the diminutive form, which means a little dog, a lap dog, or maybe a puppy. And so they would say, Jesus wasn't using the derogatory idea of a scavenger dog, one that roamed the streets, which was what people would have had in mind when they were using an insult. He uses sort of a beloved pet metaphor. And they add to that, well, look, the woman's response about, well, even the dogs are fed from the master's table says, yeah, see, this is the analogy of a pet, a beloved pet, not that of a ferocious dog. And the reality is, most commentators recognize, any way you slice it, this was clearly intended to be an insult of sorts. This was meant to put this woman in her place. And so, well, why does Jesus insult her this way? What's his motivation? And the simple answer is we don't know. We don't know why Jesus refers to her in this way. People speculate. Some say, well, maybe he's testing her faith. Maybe Jesus knows that her response is going to be what it is. And so he says this to her because he recognizes. And others look at it and say, well, maybe he's rebuking her because what she was doing in that culture was frankly rude on her part. In Mark's account, in Mark chapter 7, verses 24 and 25, his account begins by telling us that Jesus had gone into the area of the Syrophoenician area, and he didn't want anyone to know about it. This Gentile area, it says that he had gone into a house there. We don't know if it was a Jewish house. If it was, this Jew was clearly a minority in this broader Gentile area, or maybe he was even staying in some Gentile's house, in which case that would have been totally looked down upon by the Jews of his day. And so for some reason, he doesn't want people to know where he's at. His disciples are aware of it. He's there, but he's trying to keep a low profile. And somehow this woman's tracked him down, this Gentile woman, and she's maybe even barged into the house where he's at, where he's teaching, and she's kind of drawing a lot of attention to it, crying out, begging Jesus to help her. And initially he seems to be polite in the sense that, he's trying to ignore her and avoid her, but she won't have it. She doesn't take the hint. She still sort of forces herself on Jesus and begs him to do something for her. And so, as would have been culturally expected of a Jew who wasn't going to have contact with a Gentile, would have sort of in a way said, woman, get in your place. You Gentile woman, you shouldn't even be here. I mean, if this was a Jewish house, she's making the house unclean. And she's sort of corrupting, from a Jewish perspective, the environment that Jesus was in. And this would have been viewed by Jews as a rude on her part. And so maybe Jesus' response to her rudeness, kind of with an insult of his own, is his way of reprimanding her for being so assuming that he's going to do this favor for her. And even when he sort of has gently ignored her request, and in essence said no nicely, she refuses to accept no as an answer. And so he responds to her rudeness with his own insult of sorts, reminding her that she's a Gentile. He came to minister first to the Jews. And so here's this woman. She's come to Jesus, the only one who could help her, who has an answer to her problems. And not only does Jesus ignore her, but then he goes on and he insults her. If anyone had a reason to say, all right, I give up on this Jesus experiment, he obviously doesn't care about me. He obviously doesn't care about my daughter. I don't know why I wasted my time. I'm gone. And I'm through with him. Anyone who would have had a right to do that, it would have been this woman. This woman who's been ignored and now insulted by Jesus, and yet she's not going to have that. She continues to persist in her conviction that he is the answer that she's been looking for. He is the answer to her daughter's problems. Verse 27, she takes the insult. She accepts the insult. She doesn't even fight it. She says, yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. Her response to Jesus demonstrates a couple things. Number one, it demonstrates humility. Yes, Jesus, I am a dog. She seems to have been aware of that, the insult and the implication of the fact that she wasn't a Jew. She didn't grow up doing the things that Jews did. She is an outsider looking in, and she accepts that, yes, I'm a Gentile. I'm not one of these children who sort of deserves the miracles that you're performing on their behalf. I don't deserve it. It's an act of humility. But nonetheless, She accepts that Jesus is still good. She assumes that God is good, she says, but even the dogs benefit from the crumbs that fall from the master's table. Rather than drawing the conclusion, well, if you're a Gentile, I guess you're nothing. I guess God doesn't care about me then. No, she recognizes that she's a dog in the sense of she's a Gentile. Nonetheless, she assumes the best of God. She assumes that he's still good and that he is still loving. She assumes that he cares for her daughter in the same way that a master cares for that dog that's a pet in the house. Oh, that dog doesn't compare to his own kids. Well, he's not going to provide a meal for that dog the same way he'd prepare for his kids. But he still loves that dog. He still takes care of that dog. And that's essentially what she's saying. Yes, but a good father will still care for the dogs in his house. And I believe that you are good. I believe that you care about me. And I know that you care about my daughter. I wonder how you respond to the situations where you've come to God. You've cried out to Jesus for help for your children. You recognize that he's the only one that can help. But you feel like he ignores you. You feel like he doesn't respond. You might even feel like, man, any God who would allow this particular issue to happen, any God who hasn't stepped in by now, you almost feel insulted. God, how could you allow this to happen and still call yourself good? How am I supposed to believe that you're still a good God in light of what's been going on and what you haven't stepped in to change this? This woman demonstrates what true faith is. It's a faith that locks on to God and believes that he is good even when circumstances are bad. It believes and trusts that he will do what is right even when it feels like all is wrong. And so she continues to pursue him. And in verse 28, we see finally that this woman is praised by Jesus. Verse 28, Jesus says, "O woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire." And it tells us that her daughter was healed immediately. Jesus is genuinely impressed by this woman's faith, which is shown in her persistent conviction that she needs a miracle from Jesus for her child. Her faith is deeply unexpected considering her own background, considering the fact that, she wasn't taught these things. She didn't grow up in a home where these things were modeled. And here she is at some point in her adult life. She's already got a child of her own, at least one. She's evidently made some major mistakes, some sin choices in her life that likely opened her daughter up to some of these things. And here she is in desperation, and she recognizes it's never too late to go to Jesus. It's never too late to cry out to him. And even when it appears that he's not responding, she persists. What a picture of faith. I wish that I could, by way of application, say that any one of you who persists in faith and you continue to cry out to God for whatever the issues are that have caused you concern and heartache as it relates to your own children, I wish I could promise you that if you just do it enough times, if you keep going, God will eventually answer your prayers the way you want. I obviously can't say that. Our own human experience and the stories that others share tells us that that's not always the case. But there is a great related story in Luke chapter 18, a parable that Jesus is telling about a widow who's persistent. She's got some adversary, and that adversary is treating her unjustly. And as a widow in that culture, she had no recourse. She had no way to stand up for herself. And so she goes to the local judge. And in that story, that local judge is not a God-honoring judge. He doesn't fear God. He doesn't care about her. He's not a good man. And so he ignores her. She can't give him anything, and maybe we're expected to assume that her adversary has been doing something to bribe the judge or something, but he's not motivated to help her. And we're told that she just keeps going back and back and back to him. She won't stop asking him until eventually he does come through, and he does what she asks him to do. And we're told not because he's a nice man or because he fears God, but because she was so persistent that eventually her persistence has frustrated him enough to just give her what she wants. And then he says, in essence, how much more will God, your Father, who's a good God, a loving God, not in general, step in and do something for you? And so the point of the parable was to admonish people to have faith. In fact, it ends with a probing question. That parable ends with the question. It says, nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? Moms, I wonder, as it relates to your own children, particularly if they're old enough for you to have run into some significant problems or headaches or difficulties that you haven't had an answer for, and maybe you've kind of put your toe in the water with praying and for them, and maybe you've even really prayed hard for them and you haven't seen anything. I wonder, will God find faith? Will Jesus find faith on this earth when he returns? Will he find mothers who lead in their example to their own children of being mothers of faith? Not because they have the greatest heritage themselves, not because they've made all of the right decisions. They may be deeply flawed themselves, but will we find mothers who are examples of faith because they recognize in my weakness, in your weakness, son or daughter, we need Jesus. And we're going to pray to him again and again. And I'm going to pray over you to Jesus for these issues that you're dealing with, because he's the answer. Are you a mother who points your children back to Jesus by your example of prayer, that you pray over them and they recognize that in humility you tell them, I don't have answers for what you're going through. I can't solve your problems. I wish I could. I wish I could fix this. I can't. But you know what? Jesus can. And we're going to pray about it now. And we pray about it together. Is that the sort of mother, the example, is that the sort of example that you as a mother have led for your children? I mean, the great thing about the story of this woman is that it's never too late to begin that. You may not have a long history of being that sort of a mother with your own children, but what a great time to start. This Mother's Day is a great time for you as a mom to begin leading in that kind of an example. Son or daughter, I wish I had the answer and the solution to your problems. I wish I could help you with your insecurities. I wish I could help you with these feelings of depression that you have about life. I wish I could help you with these conflicts in school. I wish I could help you with your rebellious heart. I wish I could snap my fingers and make it change. I can't. But Jesus can, and I'm going to pray over you to him for you. Jason's going to wrap things up with a video for our kids.
Hey, Pleasant View, Pastor Jason here. Pastor Mike has been talking to us about the way that mothers of faith are shelters to us. Isn't this a gorgeous day? It's a beautiful day. The sun is shining, nice warm breeze. It's a gorgeous spring day. Isn't life always like this? Just roses and peaches and gorgeousness? No? No, sometimes life is really not quite as nice. And sometimes we have things in our life that are difficult and that we aren't really enjoying. And kids, do you ever have times like this when things just get hard and you don't know what's going on and you can't handle it? Don't you wish there was somebody to help you? Oh wait, that's part of why God gave us moms. See, moms do a lot of things, but part of what they do is protect us from the odd, horrible things of life. See, a good mom takes care of her kids and does the hard things. I bet you have a mom like that. And isn't it a wonderful thing to see how God uses our moms to be a blessing to us in hard times? Praise the Lord for moms. Matter of fact, kids, turn to your mom right now and say, thank you for being you. God bless you, Pleasant View. Have a good day. Happy Mother's Day.
Well, as we think this Mother's Day about this story, I guess by way of discussion in your own home, I'd like you to discuss this together. You know, every one of us, no matter how old we are, we have a mom. We've got a mother of some sort. And particularly if you were blessed with a Christian mom, what are some ways that her faith in God stood out to you? What are some elements of her example that you would recognize and praise her for? Examples of her own faith in God. Maybe you didn't have a mom who was a believer. Maybe you weren't blessed with that. Maybe you had a surrogate mom of some sort, or a stepmom, or maybe it was just some other Christian woman in your life, a grandparent or an aunt or some other relative or a Sunday school teacher or somebody. Pick somebody else, a woman in your life who was a motherly figure to you, at least in the sense of an example, someone that you looked up to, a role model for you of faith. What were some of the things in their life then that stood out to you that you would praise? And then finally, as it is Mother's Day today, if your mom's not in the room with you and isn't able to hear you discuss these things and hear you praise her, I'd like you to find a way to contact her today. Give her a phone call. Make sure you share with her, Mom, in the message today, we were talking about women of faith. We were encouraged to stop and just think about and meditate and ponder what were some of the ways that you were an example of faith to us. And here's some of the things I came up on, and I just wanted to say thank you to you for being an example of faith to me. Again, whether that's your biological mom that you call or someone else that, if they're still living today, that you have the ability to call them up and thank them for their example of faith. I encourage you to do that today.